This is the Michael Medved Show.
And another great day in this greatest nation on God's green earth. And the great responsibility of our federal government is not necessarily to feed people in the mornings. It's not necessarily to provide medical care for everybody. It certainly isn't to build light rail trains that no one rides. The great responsibility of our federal government, the great responsibility of government at all levels is to protect us from bad guys, to protect us from harm, to protect us from terrorism, to protect us particularly from the sort of terrorism that could end civilization as we know it. Now here, lots of people are thinking, oh, Medved, you're just trying to scare people needlessly. Well, it is deeply needed for people to be more concerned about what a lot of smart people that I have spoken to directly believe to be the greatest and most dire threat that nobody is talking about. It is called EMP, or Electromagnetic Pulse. The more you read about this, the more you talk to people who know about it, the more serious the matter becomes. And it is my privilege to speak to one of the world's leading experts on this threat, Dr. Peter VINCENT PRY. Dr. Pry is president of Impact America, which is a group that's dedicated to educating everybody in the country about the nature of this threat. He has 2 PhDs in international relations and U.S. history, and he has a certificate in nuclear weapons design from the United States Air Force Weapons Laboratory. He's advised Congress, he's advised NATO, he's advised many of the leading defense authorities in the country, and he's about to advise you. Dr. Pry, thank you very much for making the time.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your show, sir. I also served on the EMP Commission, the Congressional Commission, which has warned Congress and the government about this threat.
Yeah, I was just reading over your commission report. And the commission, it's a blue ribbon commission. I mean, the qualifications of the people on this, these are mainstream. This is nothing freakish. It's nothing weird. It's nothing fringy. These are mainstream defense experts, universally respected. Explain to people the essence of the danger, and then we'll talk about what is being done and not being done to confront it. The essence of the danger is what?
That terrorists or rogue states could take a single nuclear weapon, one nuclear weapon, and it doesn't have to be a special nuclear weapon. It can be a primitive first-generation nuclear weapon, and launch it on a missile over the United States. And it doesn't have to be a long-range missile. They could use a simple Scud that you can buy on the world market for, $20,000 to $50,000, and launch it off a tramp freighter, detonate it above the atmosphere, and it would generate an electromagnetic pulse, which is it's a super energetic radio wave, which it would pass through people's bodies. It wouldn't cause physical injury, but it would destroy all the electronics and shut down critical infrastructures, the power grid, telecommunications, transportation, the systems that preserve and provide food and water. It's a high-tech method of killing people the old-fashioned way. This would happen across the entire country. If you did it at an altitude of 200 miles above the center of the United States, not only would it cover all of the United States, but it would also affect parts of Canada and Mexico with a single weapon. And those of us who worked on the EMP Commission think that this is actually probably the best explanation as to why bad guys like North Korea and Iran want to get a bomb and want to get missiles, even if they're crude, inaccurate missiles, and even if the bombs aren't that good. After all, why would they put so much resources and go to such great risks, to build just a handful of nuclear weapons that certainly can't compete in technology with our nuclear arsenal and the missile systems that could deliver them? The obvious answer here, because they can't compete with us blow by blow in an all-out nuclear war. I mean, we would turn their countries into a plate of glass. But if a country like North Korea or Iran, wanted to pass a Scud missile armed with a nuclear weapon to terrorists, Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda, they could conduct a nuclear attack that would take us out of the game, win the war on terrorism, and leave no fingerprints so that we couldn't identify who the perpetrator was.
1-800-955-1776 is our phone number. Sketch out for people, because I've gone over this, and people need to know. Let's say there is, God forbid, 1,000 times a an explosion of even one of these primitive nuclear weapons on a primitive Scud missile 200 miles above the atmosphere of the United States, say in St. Louis, Missouri, what happens to you, or what happens to your life if you live, say, in New York City?
Well, initially, you wouldn't know that anything had happened. You'd probably just think it was a normal blackout until you found out that perhaps your car wouldn't start. And then the gasoline, you wouldn't be able to get that. Or the radio stations would shut down, medical machines.
Why wouldn't your car start?
Probably a lot of airplane crashes.
Why wouldn't your car start? Explain that to people.
Well, modern automobiles rely on microelectronic systems, for example, in the ignition system. They use them for fuel efficiency and the like. And these things can be damaged by or destroyed by the EMP. And so it could stop the car from starting. And even if the car does start, many cars are likely to be parked in parking garages and things like that, so they might not be initially exposed to the pulse. You can't. The gas stations won't work unless the power grid is running. And so even if you were one of the fortunate people that had a working automobile, it would only run as long as you've got gas in the tank. And there'd be no way of getting gas because you need electricity for the fuel pumps to work.
And no electricity, no heat. How long, in best case scenario, would it take to get the electricity back?
Well, you might never get the electricity back. And in fact, if we don't do something to protect our society and follow the recommendations that the EMP Commission made, the electricity won't come back. That's one of the reasons we're having.
When you say won't come back, explain.
Pardon me? When
you say won't come back, explain. Won't come back for a year? Won't come back for 10 years?
Won't ever come back because the electric grid, critical to the operation of our electric grid, are several hundred big transformers. Every major metropolitan area is serviced by these big transformers. There are the things, for example, that there's big transformers up near the Niagara Falls hydroelectric plant, and they drive the electricity all the way down to New York City and to other major metropolitan areas on the East Coast. And then there's a transformer at the end of that steps it down so it then can be used in these cities. These transformers, they're not built in this country anymore. They're very difficult to build. They have to be custom-made for the role that they play in the power grid. There's only two or three countries in the world that build them for export. Japan, South Korea, Germany. And it typically takes 18 months when you order one to build one of these things because they have to be custom-made. So if you were out those 300 transformers, you're looking for at least a year and a half before you would have under the current situation, a year and a half before you could replace those transformers. So we would have to be living without electricity for a year and a half. And at least in the Commission's estimate, that's not going to be possible. This country can't exist for a year and a half. It probably can't exist for 6 months without electricity. And those transformers are absolutely vital in order for the electric grid to work. So that's why I say it would never come back, because in our current situation, without protecting those transformers or having a means to quickly replace them, our society would dissolve into anarchy and chaos. We estimate that within 12 months of an EMP event, we'd probably lose 2/3 of our population to starvation, disease, dehydration. EMP is a high-tech way of killing people the old-fashioned way.
When you say starvation, what you're talking literally not being able to deliver food?
Right, and the food that we have stored spoiling. If you live in the Northeast or have gone to a grocery store prior to a blizzard, you've probably noticed how the food flies off the shelves. Typically, there's only enough food in a grocery store to feed the local population for 2 to 3 days, under normal consumption, 2 to 3 days. You've probably noticed there are big trucks that are always parked behind your grocery store. That's because the grocery stores have to be resupplied from regional food warehouses. These are huge warehouses that service sometimes a multi-state area, and that's where the national food larder is. There's about a 30 to 60-day supply of food that could feed the whole nation in these food warehouses. But the food has to be preserved by temperature controls, air conditioning systems, refrigerators, and the like, which all depend on electricity. And we have the experience. We know what happens when there's blackouts. For example, in Hurricane Katrina, and when Andrew happened.
We will get to that, because what we're talking about is the whole country suffering a catastrophe well in excess of Hurricane Katrina. So what can be done about it? And what kind of leadership is the Obama administration showing on this issue, if any? We will confront that and much, much more with Dr. Peter Vincent Pry on the EMP threat.
1-800-955-1776. Michael Medved. Michael Medved Studio is brought to you by the franchisees of Mathnasium Learning Centers, teaching kids math the way that makes sense to them. Parents, request information by calling 877-MATH411.
21 minutes after the hour on the Michael Medved Show, you can read information about the subject under discussion, information based upon the National Commission on the threat of an electromagnetic pulse attack, an EMP attack. We're speaking to a member of that congressional commission who is trying to alert the country to some of these dangers. His name is Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. And by the way, for those who believe that there's no need to be concerned about this, there is a citation that James Shin, who is an Assistant Secretary of Defense, has reported that Iran's military has been actively discussing the effects of an EMP attack on the United States. And if Iran doesn't scare you enough, then think about North Korea, and think about the fact that the Undersecretary Shin also says, Assistant Secretary Shin, that China is actively developing such weapons. Do you have information, Dr. Pry, about other nations that are actively seeking to master EMP technology with the potential devastating impact on the United States?
Oh, yes. I think Secretary Shin's information probably is derived from the Commission originally. You know, we found copious military writings from Iran right in the open source where they explicitly talk about making EMP attacks against the United States for the purpose of taking us out on the world stage. We have seen them practice launching short-range missiles, Scud missiles, off of a freighter in the Caspian Sea, just as you would do for the scenario that we were concerned about launching a missile off of a ship. You don't need to have the capability to launch a missile off of a ship if you're Iran in order to strike somebody in the Middle East, because the Shahab-3 medium-range missile can strike all of their potential targets in the Middle East. You only practice doing it off a ship if you want to attack someone not in the Middle East. We've also seen them use their Shahab-3, which would be an ideal missile, by the way, to be launched from a freighter. It's a medium-range missile that can get to the altitude that we were talking about before, so you could cover the whole U.S. with an EMP effect. We have seen them launch this thing to high altitude and fuse it at high altitude. There's no other explanation for practicing that trajectory and that fusing mode for that missile except an EMP attack. So they write about it. The only thing that's missing, they write about it. They practice launching the missiles. They practice launching off a ship platform. The only thing that's missing from their capabilities currently is a nuclear weapon, which most people expect them to get in the very near future. And if they don't build one of their own, they might well be able to buy one from North Korea.
1-800-955-1776 is our phone number. Let me ask you one more question, then we'll go directly to our calls. I assume that the Obama administration is moving decisively and very actively and energetically to confront this threat.
Alas, no. So far, the only thing the Obama administration has done is in May it did pass a presidential directive to protect senior leadership communications from the nuclear EMP attack. So it'll comfort your listeners to know that the Washington bureaucrats will be able to continue to communicate in the aftermath of an attack, but that doesn't do anything for the survivability of the American people. That's why we're having this conference, which will be attended by EMP commissioners and other senior national security experts up in Niagara Falls. It's sponsored by this grassroots movement, Impact America, citizens who read, the EMP Commission reports on their own started this movement, and they've got this I would urge everybody interested who cares about this to go to their website, which is www.empactamerica.org. That's EMPACT America.org.
We'll link to it at our website.
Thank you.
At michaelmedved.com. Let's go to Eric in Dallas. You're on the Michael Medved Show with Dr. Pry. Hello, Eric.
Hello?
Yeah. Hi, you're on.
Hi, Mike. I just had a question. From what I've read in some government-published older books on nuclear weapons, the EMP is actually caused by the gamma radiation pulse from the nuclear bomb passing through the upper atmosphere. That induces the EMP, and it would take a megaton range bomb to induce a really heavy EMP, and like a kiloton range bomb, like say North Korea or Iran would have, say 20 kilotons. I wouldn't think that would be a big enough. I mean, maybe it would cause some problems, but I can't see it wiping out all the electronics in the United States.
Well,
what about that, Dr. Pry?
Well, this is a great misconception. Back in the Cold War, and I used to work on this in the Cold War, we thought that the best weapon for an EMP attack would be a high-yield weapon, like a megaton-class weapon. And this is because it's a different effect from the one you're describing. It's called the E3, or there's a magnetohydrodynamic effect. It's not the gamma rays for the E3. It's the fact that it causes the geomagnetic field to fluctuate. And that's what causes an electromagnetic pulse that could take down power grids if you were to approach it that way. However, toward the end of the Cold War, both sides, Russia and the United States, came up with what are called super EMP weapons. We never developed these. We tested them, but we never deployed them. And these are very low-yield weapons that can produce tremendous gamma rays, which does the E1 effect, which is what you were describing, so-called Compton electrons. And the Commission found that the Russians have developed these things, deployed them, and they say so in their open-source writings. So do the Chinese. And the Russians warned the Commission that because of Russian brain drain to North Korea, these nuclear weapons that the North Koreans have, which in the newspapers have been referred to as crude nuclear weapons because of their low yield, actually the signature of those weapons looks exactly like a super EMP weapon. They may be at low yield, not because they're not good weapons. They may be low yield because they're designed to produce these gamma rays at very low yield.
Let's go to Charlie in Amarillo, Texas. You're on the Medved Show with Dr. Pry.
Yeah, I don't know. I realize you guys are very intelligent stuff, but once you get 200 miles up, you're working with the Earth's magnetic field, and we get more of that EMT-type radiation from the sun, and the magnetic field takes care of it pretty darn good. So if you get up high enough to where you could do the whole United States, it would dissipate so bad in the magnetic field that I think you guys are missing it pretty bad.
Okay, Dr. Pry?
Well, he's referring to the Van Allen belts, which interfere with solar flares. And the Van Allen belts do protect us against solar flares. But the Compton electron effect, the Van Allen belts don't provide any protection against a nuclear EMP, which is a different phenomena. And I would add that the National Academy of Sciences just completed a study earlier this year. The Van Allen belts can only protect us against certain kinds of solar flares.
We will get to more on this. And talking about protecting ourselves, what about some kind of anti-missile defense? Would that be of any help or any use defending against an EMP attack, an electromagnetic pulse attack that could destroy our civilization? We'll continue the conversation with Dr. Pry and your calls coming up.
The Michael Medved Show, michaelmedved.com. The Michael Medved studio lines are sponsored by GoToMyPC.com. Access your office PC from anywhere with GoToMyPC.com.
34 minutes after the hour on the Michael Medved Show, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry is president of Impact America, a citizens group dedicated to educating the public on the threat from nuclear and natural electromagnetic pulse EMP. In a previous life, he was a verification analyst at the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, responsible for assessing Soviet compliance. He also has worked as an intelligence officer with the Central Intelligence Agency, responsible for analyzing Soviet and Russian nuclear strategy and operational plans. And he did that for 10 years. If Dr. Pry says, be concerned, you would have to be a powerful fool not to be concerned. Let's go to Barrett in San Diego, California. You're on the Michael Medved Show with Dr. Pry.
Thanks, Michael. Dr. Fry, in order to get rid of this Y2K attitude like your first caller, wasn't there an unintentional test in the South Pacific that proved EMP is extremely powerful?
Oh, yes. It was the Starfish Prime test back in 1962 that occurred over Johnston Island, and it caused damage to electronic systems in the Hawaiian Islands. But
let's understand, this was a nuclear test. It happened
Yes.
in 1962, before the test ban treaty took full effect. So they did an atmospheric nuclear test, and then what happened?
It caused a wide variety of electrical systems in Hawaii: street lights, burglar alarms, even the underground Trans-Pacific cable was affected, by the EMP. And the Hawaiian Islands were on the periphery of the effect. They weren't in the center of the effect. They were 1,000 kilometers away, way off on the edge of the effect. Our chairman, Dr. Graham, the fellow who headed up the commission, that was his first job. He actually was there when the EMP phenomena was first discovered by the United States, working on it in 1962, and spent a lifetime working on it. And it wasn't the only test where we also have EMP simulators so that we can test the EMP effects on electronics, and that's another way we know that modern electronics are vulnerable, because our commission took modern electronics and exposed them to the kinds of field strengths that you would expect. Not from a super EMP. We can't actually simulate that high, but from crude, even a tactical nuclear weapon, for example, a tactical nuclear artillery shell that would produce the smallest EMP field strengths we could expect to get from a small nuclear weapon. And even those field strengths are enough to damage modern electronics. The better our electronics get, the faster they operate, the more vulnerable they become. The very thing that makes them efficient, their speed, their ability to operate on very low voltages, also makes them extremely susceptible to EMP. Modern electronics are 1 million times more vulnerable than the crude vacuum tube electronics from the 1960s.
Okay, let's get this very straight, because this is, for a lot of people who are listening to us, I think this is new information. But aside from the danger of some madman, a Kim Jong-il or Osama bin Laden or someone of Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, saying we want to destroy the great state in the United States, there's a very real danger here, isn't there, of a nation threatening and using the power of a credible threat of this kind of explosion against the United States, is there not?
Yes, there is. And in fact, Russia actually threatened us in May 1999 during the Balkans War. Threatened the U.S. Congress during a meeting there. But there's another dimension to the threat we haven't even talked about, and that is nature can cause this threat too. The EMP Commission and the National Academy of Sciences independently did studies on what's called a great geomagnetic storm. Every now and then, every 100 years or so, the sun can put out a gigantic solar flare that will hit our geosphere, the geomagnetic sphere surrounding the Earth, in such a way that it would cause an EMP effect very like the EMP that you'd get from a powerful nuclear weapon. And this can do exactly the same thing that a terrorist or rogue state nuclear attack. And the difference here is, even if one is skeptical about the threat from Russia or China or Iran or North Korea, and I personally, I am not skeptical about those threats. I think that that's why they're trying to get these weapons. But if one is, the fact of the matter is this natural threat is inevitable. It will happen someday, and many scientists think we're overdue for this.
Okay, so what do we do to prepare for it? And what about the idea of missile defense? The Obama administration committed to cutting back on missile defense at a time when I think a lot of cooler and smarter heads believe we should be moving full speed ahead. We'll talk about that and more with Dr. Peter Vincent Pry and your calls coming up.
The Michael Medved Studio is brought to you by the franchisees of Mathnasium Learning Centers, teaching kids math the way that makes sense to them. Parents, request information by calling 877-MATH-411. Michael Medved studio lines are sponsored by GoToMyPC.com. Access your office PC from anywhere with GoToMyPC.com.
44 minutes after the hour on the Michael Medved Show, joined by Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, who is engaged in the extraordinarily important work of alerting America and Americans to the very real dangers of electromagnetic pulse. And I will tell you, Dr. Pry, I had first become aware of this several years ago. And my late father, my dad died on March 11th of this year. And my father was a physicist and solid-state physicist and had worked for NASA in the past and taught at UCLA and knew something about this field. And I went to him very directly. I said, Dad, is this a lot of science fiction nonsense or is this serious? And he said, no. He said, I'm actually surprised somebody hasn't tried it so far. And he says, this is probably the main thing we have to worry about. And because he's my father and because I know his own background, I know something of your background. I mean, I think that people who want to say that, this doesn't need any more attention are kidding themselves and living to some extent with a false sense of security. Is there anything that could be done regarding missile defense that could make us safer against the threat of a super EMP attack?
Well, missile defense, I do support missile defense, but missile defense isn't the best answer to this. For example, missile defense won't do anything against a great geomagnetic storm. And the scenario we're most concerned about, which is, terrorists launching a short-range nuclear missile off of a freighter, doesn't leave you a lot of response time. Having said that, I am a supporter of missile defense, but ultimately this is a good news story. There are other things we can do that the Commission recommended. In fact, there's no excuse for us being vulnerable to EMP. The Commission produced a plan that in 3 to 5 years, with very little expenditure, we could get our critical infrastructures protected against EMP. For instance, those big transformers that I was talking about that are absolutely indispensable to the survival of our national power grid and therefore to our civilization as a whole. You could put surge arresters on those and protect them from an electromagnetic pulse, whether it's nuclear or caused by nature. We have contingency plans in the Department of Defense. Whenever there is a crisis or people are starving in Africa or in the aftermath of an earthquake, to go to foreign countries and provide food and water to those people. But we don't have contingency plans like that for the United States, and we don't seem to be learning. After Andrew, after Katrina, there was no plans in place. In fact, a reluctance to bring in the military, to do what was necessary to save people's lives. A lot of what needs to be done isn't a matter of spending money. It's just thinking about it and planning for the contingency.
Are there any politicians that you know of who have begun to raise this issue or to try to mobilize the public?
Absolutely.
Or the Congress?
As a matter of fact, it's a well-kept secret in the media that this is one of the few bipartisan issues. You've got a conservative congressman. One of the leaders on this has been Roscoe Bartlett from Maryland. And his counterpart in the House, the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, Benny Thompson, is a liberal Democrat. And they are completely united on this and are trying to get through Congress legislation now that would reestablish the EMP Commission. And so the Commission could advise Congress and the departments and agencies of the government on what to do, how to implement the plan, how to go forward so we can get our country protected against it.
This might be even a more important expenditure of public money than, say, cash for clunkers. I don't know.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm teasing. I'm teasing. Let's go to Gary in Chicago. Gary, you're on the Medved Show with Dr. Pry.
Hi, Mike. Love the show. Great topic. Just a quick question/comment for your guest, and then I'll hang up so I can listen to the response. I don't deny, as a physics major myself, the importance of protecting ourselves against an EMP. However, the question I have is how does our ability to produce food for the world affect someone's decision to attack us? Because if it does, in fact, cripple our ability to travel, move about, pump gas, and which would also include food production, someone attacking us would have to take that into consideration, knowing that they might even be starving themselves.
Interesting question, Gary. Thanks.
Well, the world doesn't always operate rationally. You know, that same argument was used before World War I to argue that it couldn't happen because the economies of Europe were so integrated and so interdependent that a great war in Europe would be a catastrophe, and so it wouldn't happen. And those same beliefs also were arguments were trotted out before World War II, but that turned out not to be. Unfortunately, nation-states don't always operate rationally. And the nations we're most concerned about, for example, Iran, I mean, it's not a big food importer for the United States, where the United States is concerned. And I think they could calculate a little differently, that if they were to take, these states, countries like Iran and North Korea, they see us in their paranoid worldview as a clear and present danger to them. You know, we see ourselves as the good guys, and we are, in fact, the good guys. But they see us as a clear and present danger. And the idea that they need us to provide them with food or other goods would probably be outweighed in their calculations, I think, you know, by the need to eliminate us as a threat to their national existence.
Let's go to
they do
John.
see us as a threat to their national existence.
John in Tacoma, Washington. You're on the Medved Show with Dr. Pry.
Oh, good afternoon, gentlemen. Well, this is something I've been interested in for many decades. And it seems to me that a lot of citizens could do a lot to protect themselves and some of their electronics with simple Faraday cages, that a few diagrams in the newspaper would help there. But I would think these other countries would realize that while specialized weapons are all very nice, back to the time of Starfish Prime and even back to Orange and Teak in 1958, we still have a certain number of missile-carried high-yield warheads that could be sent to any of these potential threats and detonated above them.
But that's only if you can identify the source. One of the points, John, that Dr. Pry was making is that this kind of weapon, it's very, very difficult to identify where it comes from exactly. It's not going to have fingerprints on it necessarily. We'll get a response from Dr. Peter Vincent Pry and more on the EMP threat coming up.
The Michael Medved Studio is brought to you by the franchisees of Mathnasium Learning Centers, teaching kids math the way that makes sense to them. Parents, request information by calling 877-MATH-411. Michael Medved Studio lines are sponsored by GoToMyPC.com. Access your office PC from anywhere with GoToMyPC.com.
55 minutes past the hour on the Michael Medved Show with Dr. Peter Vincent Pry of the Impact America, which is trying to mobilize support for more attention to the EMP threat, the electromagnetic pulse threat. We just have a few moments to go, Dr. Pry. There is no easy way to determine retaliation for an EMP attack if it is done by a hostile power, is there?
Not if they do use the scenario we're concerned about, where you use terrorists, launch it off a ship. The EMP, the bomb detonating in outer space, won't leave debris that we could collect so that we could identify the source of the weapon.
Yeah, let's go to John, another John, in Yakima, Washington. You're on the Michael Medved Show with Dr. Pry.
Yeah, here we go again, all our eggs in one basket, huh? Well, like I've said for years, I work for a utility area, and we could get the power back on. You wouldn't be able to have the electronics controls. We would just have to bypass a lot, which we do routinely to do maintenance on other substations. We'll take one out and feed all the lines back another way. Mechanically, we can get the power back on. That's not the problem. You'd have to replace all the electronics. But we could get the power back on from the dams to the generating oil plants to whatever, because a transformer is just a mechanical piece of equipment filled with oil as a dielectric. It doesn't do anything until you actually bring electricity into it. And
okay, why is he wrong, Dr. Pry?
He's wrong because the SCADAs, for example, it's not just the transformers. Of course, we only have a limited amount of time here to talk about it. But for example, the SCADAs these are system control and data acquisition systems that are crucial to the operation also of the electric grid.
They shut down immediately.
And we don't have the manpower we used to have.
Yes, we do. You know how many electrical workers there are in the United States?
I know how many there are, sir.
24/7?
When we have a blackout up here, we now have to bring electric workers from Georgia to repair an electric blackout in Maryland. That wasn't the case in the 60s and 70s.
Every utility in every town can take care of their area. And the problem is
not
just
true.
the electronics.
That's not true.
It's also you're going to have to harden the electronics. That's the answer. Then an EMP will not matter. I mean, it's going to cost money, but the more we make, the less it costs, and make it a moot point.
What about hardening the electronics? Is that possible, Dr. Pry?
Well, that's what I was proposing before. For example, one of the things you can do is put surge arresters on those transformers. That will help protect them. One of the things the Commission was doing before it terminated was it was working on a hard SCADA that would not cost a lot of money, so that these SCADAs would be proof against it.
It just seems that when we're talking about stimulus packages and pie in the sky, solar energy and windmills, doing something like this where the Commission has been very specific, I mean, aside from everything else, it makes America more secure, provides jobs, provides work, and moves us in the direction that we need to go. I salute you, sir, for your work in trying to mobilize America. Go to our website. We have more information about the work of MPACT. It is important for the future of this greatest nation on God's green earth.